Mr. Dodd, what do you think is the basic crux of this whole problem?
Well, Doctor, I feel that the problem itself originates with that aspect of human life which condemns men collectively to experience what is known as the fall of man, and that subsequently Christ became into the world with the knowledge that the individual could confront this condition and not become victimized by it, but that entailed the individual emulating Christ, who through the temptations in the wilderness was confronted by the satanic, listened to what the satanic had to offer, and say no, and then add, and I know you to be Satan, and Satan went away. That to me is the clue to how to nullify this influence which has had humanity in its grip for centuries. Well, of course, what it means is that one has to accept the realism of the inclusion of evil, and that in turn challenges the world of education to equip the student with the knowledge necessary to recognize evil in action within the sphere of his own experiences and refuse to be part of it. Then this influence which has been behind the creation of this network can't operate. It cannot operate in the light. And admittedly, it says that it acknowledges that, so that it is, those who are part of it knowingly are scared to death that somebody at some point, as they put it, is going to pick up the end of a string and little by little follow it to the end. And as they put it to me, when that happens, we're through.
27 years ago, the Congress of the United States authorized the formation of a Congressional Investigating Committee to try to analyze the functions of the great foundations in America, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Mr. Norman Dodd was the Director of Research for the Congressional Committee that came to be known as the Reese Committee. Mr. Dodd is an economist. He's a consultant as far as investment is concerned. But during that period, that very important period, some 27 years ago, he headed research in the effort to find out what indeed were the great foundations doing in America. Mr. Dodd, what did you find out was the stated objective and goals of the great American foundations?
We found out, Doctor, that these foundations had as their objective the orientation of the people of this country to the idea of collectivism, and thereby nullifying for good and all the commitment of the country to individualism, which was the feature of the country at the beginning.
Now, how did they go about doing this?
Well, primarily they did it, Doctor, by securing control of what is known as the money supply of the people of this country.
You're speaking now of the money supply that was going into education.
Well, it's the money supply of the people of the country as a whole.
And how did they do this?
They did this by working out a system of banking, which was foreign in its concept, but it enabled debt to be what we call monetized, transformed into bank deposits.
Now, how did they specifically set out to influence education in America?
Well, by having at their disposal unlimited quantities of this newly created money and being able to reward the personalities who are active in the world of education, administratively as well as academically.
Were they able to influence the textbooks or the teachers?
Yes, they were. They were able to see that textbooks were almost produced on order, and assuring the publishers of textbooks of the funds necessary to make publication of those books profitable.
That was the capacity of what they call Director of Research for the Reese Committee.
Can you tell us what the Reese Committee was attempting to do?
Yes, I can tell you. It was operating and carrying out instructions embodied in a resolution passed by the House of Representatives, which was to investigate the activities of foundations as to whether or not these activities could justifiably be labeled un-American without, I might say, defining what they meant by un-American. But that was the resolution, and the committee had then the task of selecting a council, and the council in turn had the task of selecting a staff, and he had to have somebody who would direct the work of that staff, and that was what they meant by the Director of Research.
What were some of the details, the specifics that you told the committee at that time?
Well, Mr. Griffin, in that report, I specifically, number one, defined what was, to us, what was meant by the phrase un-American. And we defined that in our way as being a determination to effect changes in the country by unconstitutional means. We have plenty of constitutional procedures, assuming that we wish to effect a change in the form of government or that sort of thing. And therefore, any effort in that direction which did not avail itself of the procedures which were authorized by the Constitution could be justifiably called un-American. That was the start of educating them up to that particular point. The next thing was to educate them as to the effect on the country as a whole of the activities of large endowed foundations over the then past 40 years.
What was that effect, sir?
That effect was to orient our educational system away from support of the principles embodied in the Declaration of Independence and implemented in the Constitution, and educated them over to the idea that the task now was, as a result of the orientation of education, to away from these briefly stated principles and self-evident truths. And that's what had been the effect of the wealth which constituted the endowments of those foundations that had been in existence over the largest portion of the span of 50 years, and holding them responsible for this change. And what we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education, which they discuss throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. Then finally, they answer that question as follows: we must control the State Department. And they answer it by saying, we must take over and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. Dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them, it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration of the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. Yeah, I might tell you this experience, as far as its impact on Catherine Casey is concerned, was she never was able to return to her law practice. If it hadn't been for Carol Reese's ability to tuck her away on a job with the Federal Trade Commission, I don't know what would have happened to Catherine, but ultimately she lost her mind as a result of it.
Because it's only in the light of that policy that these events and effects make any sense. And this is how, and this is their problem, Doctor. They cannot avoid having effects result from the grants that they make. They cannot avoid it. Therefore, those of this in this country who would be concerned with what are they up to merely has to look at the effects and work back and compare the effects of a grant with the explanation of the grant in the first place. I mean, I'll just use as an instance that clarify the matter. You will remember there was a time when the Federal Reserve System was installed in this country by the Congress. In other words, it was legalized. And it had been preceded by a long period of years and a struggle to get the Federal Reserve approved. Finally, it was approved, and the argument that swung the approval in that direction was that if the system is installed, the result will be the elimination of bank failures. And inasmuch as there had been in those days a plethora of bank failures, this was held up as a very beneficial development practice, what they call fractional reserve central banking. But nobody goes back, this was in 1912, nobody goes back to 1930 when every bank in the United States was closed. Every bank. There wasn't a solvent bank in the United States. That, you see, was proof that the original purpose was in no sense to eliminate bank failures. And this discrepancy and these contrasts and these contradictions are the telltale part that those who have imposed these practices on us as a people are scared to death that it's going to be picked up and stressed and taught and so forth and so on. One accredited educational institution with trustees who openly declared that we noticed this. We noticed the inconsistency, the contradictions, and we are setting forth an effort to account for them. And that, in my opinion, would explode the whole network. And they have told me that this is what they're scared to death. Somebody is going to pick up this string.
What we need to stand up and say is not only did they attack the USS Liberty, they did 9/11. They did it. I have had long conversations over the past 2 weeks with contacts at the Army War College, at the Headquarters Marine Corps, and I've made it absolutely clear in both cases that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation, period. First, the disbelief, and what I showed them immediately afterwards is an interview with a demolitions expert named Danny Jowenko, and it shows the third building at the World Trade Center going down. And they look at that, and I said, now you understand that if one of the buildings was wired for demolition, all of them were wired for demolition. And that's it. That's the tipping point. Getting into arguments about who was flying what and where they were and whether there was nanothermite, those things are true, but they're incidental. The thing that's necessary is to tell people 3 buildings went down, the third was not hit by a plane, it was wired for controlled demolition, therefore all of them were wired for controlled demolition, and at that point the reaction is rage. First disbelief and then rage. 9/11 has led directly 60,000 Americans dead and wounded. God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people in other countries that we've killed or wounded or made homeless. This is an open wound. And what Americans need to understand is they did it. They did it. And if they do understand that, Israel's going to disappear. Israel will flat-ass disappear from this earth. I sent a film to one of my colleagues, and it basically had Americans grieving over their dead coming back. And I showed one of them, it was a woman just wrenched by grief, over her dead soldier. And I said, if Americans ever know that Israel did this, they're going to scrub them off the earth. And they're not going to give a rat's ass what the cost is. They are not going to care. The first thing marked is astonishment. They didn't know. They truly didn't know. And these are not unintelligent people. They really didn't know. And the next statement is rage. Real rage. The Zionists are playing this as truly an all-or-nothing exercise. Because if they lose this one, if the American people ever realize what happened, they're done. The military has not been bought. The military is loyal, but it has not been bought. And if it ever understands this, really, really deeply understands this, and this is what I got when I put some of these things to the Army War College and to Headquarters Marine Corps. I mentioned to a contact at Headquarters Marine Corps, I said, you know they did 9/11. And it was, you don't mean it. I said, absolutely. And if they ever understand that, these people are history.
Completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. Bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of
terror.
Who else
identify though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's responsible. Every simple step, crossing borders or going on a plane or on a ship, will become more complicated. It's a time to launch a operational, concrete war against terror, even if it takes certain pains from the routine activities of our normal society. This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. Consistently, along 6 or 10 years, Iran, Iraq, Libya.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." So I came back to see him a few weeks later. And by that time, we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper. He said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
Israel confirmed today that it launched an airstrike on Syria last month. The attack has been the subject of much speculation in the Middle East, but in Israel, the military censors stopped reporters from going public with the story.
Starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
This is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. Consistently, along 6 or 10 years, Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order. No world order.
Now, it's one of the main reasons for America's support of Israel. And later on today in Washington, a group called AIPAC will hold its annual policy conference. Among the speakers will be the US Vice President and the Israeli Foreign Minister. But what is AIPAC? It is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a pro-Israel lobby group aimed at pressuring politicians into maintaining close relationships. It was set up shortly after Israel's foundation and now has over 100,000 members, though not all of those are Jewish. It's regularly ranked as one of the top 3 most powerful pressure groups in Washington. Indeed, the New York Times calls it the most important organization affecting America's relationship with Israel.
Gathered here this morning, some of us are Republicans, some are Democrats, yet all of us share a fundamental belief that the freedom and security of Israel are of vital interest to the United States of America.
A.B. Brown was sold in 97 to Bankers Trust, then to Deutsche Bank, I think in 98 or 99. It was an offshoot of Deutsche Bank. Now, one thing that I know, that I have written heavily about, is that the CIA, the Mossad, and major intelligence services track all stock trading in real time. On my website, you'll see stories about Promise software, and it's very long to go into, but it's a very sophisticated software. I'm going to write the website for you. It's a very sophisticated software that's been made with artificial intelligence and is capable of integrating wide numbers of databases in different languages. You'll find this on my website at www.copvcia.com. Now, I know that CIA and Mossad track stock trades in real time, so if all these put options were placed on American and United, do you think that should have triggered some alarm inside the Central Intelligence Agency? But instead we find that the trades were placed through a firm that was once owned, managed by the guy who was the number 3 at CIA. These are just pieces of evidence now. I'm building the case. Now, again, we're building up some history here. In January of this year, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda destroyed the entire opium crop in Afghanistan. It's been verified by the United Nations, by the Drug Enforcement Administration, by ABC News, by BBC, who put people on the ground. Afghanistan had been the world's largest producer of opium, producing 70% of the world's heroin through the year 2000. In January, they destroyed their crop. Part of it was a price support. They had overproduced the year before, part of it, and they sold from their stockpiles. But there are no opium crops in Afghanistan right now. They've all been planted, of course, since the Bush administration and the CIA have lifted the ban, and everybody can go back to work and the CIA can move the heroin again.
Something that is not being reported in the U.S. press, but is getting quite wide coverage in England and in Europe. And that is that the result of our backing the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan this year is to restore a heroin flow which would otherwise have been halved or more in the world, because the Taliban not only announced that they were going to outlaw planting, but their decree worked. There was no Taliban opium planted last year, and that meant a reduction of 90% in the amount of opium coming out of Afghanistan, and the 10% that was left represented a radical increase in the areas under Northern Alliance control. Now, if we had not gone into Afghanistan, this would have been the most effective reduction in the flow of heroin in the world since the DEA was created 30 years ago. But by going into Afghanistan, backing the Northern Alliance, We've now chased the Taliban out, and in all kinds of provinces where the farmers had started to plant wheat, they're now plowing up their fields and putting in opium instead. And the global drug authorities at the UN expect that we're going to go back to the record flow of opium that we've seen in the last couple of years.
But we heard right after the attacks on September 11th, Tony Blair saying, we will bomb the poppy fields. Well, there are no poppy fields. They destroyed their crops. I was in Moscow, Russia in March of this year, and I found out that Uzbekistan, and we're going to get to Uzbekistan in a minute, was awash in a sea of poppies. And what did I find also was that companies like Southern Air Transport, Evergreen, and other CIA-connected affiliates had been flying into and out of Tashkent. The CIA had been setting up operations. There were proprietary companies all over the place in Uzbekistan. So now we have the destruction of an opium crop, which does what? It takes cash out of the world's banking system. In conjunction with a stock market bubble, in conjunction with world oil prices or world oil production diminishing, and a huge bubble on Wall Street. Now we come to, this is just from recently, of course. This is from the October 5th. Afghan rebels, that's the Northern Alliance, our good friends. The Northern Alliance, who actually dominate the opium trade from the north of Afghanistan. Okay, now we've seen the recent stories saying that the poppy farmers are absolutely rejoicing because they've gone back to planting. So now we come back to the oil and drugs. There's an old saying, God equals gold, oil, and drugs. Testimony from February 12, 1998 in Washington, D.C. before the House International Relations Committee by John Maresca, Vice President of International Relations for UNICAL, which had been planning to build a pipeline for some time from the Central Asian oil fields of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all the stands, across Afghanistan down to the Pakistani coast. It's a distance of about 1,500 miles. To a terminal where U.S. tankers would take the oil and gas and ship it to China and Japan, the largest emerging markets in the world. China's in the middle of a huge oil crisis, and the U.S. Wall Street is pouring money into China hand over fist. And he says in this, construction cannot begin construction until an internationally recognized Afghanistani government is in place. A recent study for the World Bank states that the proposed pipeline for Central Asia across Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Arabian Sea would provide more favorable netbacks, that's money in your pocket, folks, to oil producers. That's his testimony. Now, UNICAL put the pipeline on hold in 1999. They also hired a guy named Henry Kissinger to consult for them, which explains why Afghanistan has never been listed as a sponsoring terrorist nation. Isn't that strange? The head of all the terrorists in the world, and the biggest country, has never been listed. Okay, U.S. companies to invest in Pakistan oil and gas sectors. This is from a Pakistani newspaper, the Frontier Post. The date is, what is the date? October 10th. And what this says, now October the 10th is after we've gone to war, after the attacks on World Trade Center, after we know, is anybody surprised at how quickly we kind of won in Afghanistan? Okay. Well, the war's been planned for 4 years, and I'm saving the best for last, but the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan met with the Pakistani oil minister and briefed the ambassador on the proposed Turkmenistan-Afghanistan Pakistan gas pipeline, and said that this project opens up new avenues of multidimensional regional cooperation, particularly in view of the recent geopolitical developments in the region. Gee, the pipeline that was blocked is now back on full tilt just days after we started the bombing. Suspicious. Okay, maybe I haven't convinced you of everything, but we're just getting warmed up now. This is how Afghanistan went unlisted as a terror responser. This is the story that I found, and it says right here, UNICAL hired former State Department insiders, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Special U.S. Ambassador John. The guy was also, I didn't see that. The UNICAL guy was also a special ambassador. And Robert Oakley, a former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan. You're going to love where Henry Kissinger turns up on this, by the way. All right. This is one other thing about Kissinger. Chinese oil firm picks Kissinger as advisor. This is from November 4th. Thank you. The Chinese National Offshore Oil Company has hired Henry Kissinger to head its foreign advisory board. Now, Kissinger's got the Pakistan end and he's got the China end of this oil pipeline. Who does Henry Kissinger front for?
Rockefeller.
Very good. David Rockefeller. Who's that? Zbigniew Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski was counselor for strategic and international studies, professor of American foreign policy at Johns Hopkins, national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter, trustee and founder of the Trilateral Commission, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, international advisor to several major corporations, associate of Henry Kissinger, also worked for Ronald Reagan in intelligence capacities. Co-chairman of the Bush National Security Advisory Task Force in 1988. What a guy. Zbig. Now, if you want to get really, 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 really angry, go buy this book. It's called The Grand Chessboard: American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Objectives. Written by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997. I'm going to read you some quotes from that book. Page XII, it's the very first words in the book. The last decades of the 20th century has witnessed a tectonic shift in world affairs. For the first time ever, a non-Eurasian power has emerged not only as a key arbiter of Eurasian power relations, but also as the world's paramount power. The defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union was the final step in the rapid ascendance of a Western Hemisphere power, the United States, as the sole and indeed the first truly global superpower. Page XII, it's in the preface. But in the meantime, he says, it is imperative that no Eurasian challenger, Eurasia is everything in between roughly east of Germany all the way to the Pacific Ocean, south through the Indian subcontinent, includes the Middle East. It's imperative that no Eurasian challenger, by that he means Russia or China, emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus of also challenging America. The formulation of a comprehensive and integrated Eurasian geostrategy is therefore the purpose of this book, Geostrategy, Eurasia. The attitude of the American public toward the external projection of American power has been much more ambivalent. The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It gets worse. For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. Now a non-Eurasian power, that's us, is preeminent in Eurasia, and America's global primacy, isn't that arrogant? America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained. What he's saying is that if the U.S. wants to stay top dog, we have to control Eurasia. America's withdrawal from the world, or because of the sudden emergence of a successful rival, would produce massive international stability. It would prompt global anarchy. You know what he's saying there? Yeah, a little global anarchy would probably be a damn good thing right now. What he's saying there is if we don't control the world by whatever means necessary, the world's going to be miserable. He didn't ask my opinion. Did he ask yours? Okay. In that context, how America manages Eurasia, do we manage people around the world? Is that our job? Is critical. Eurasia is the globe's largest continent and is geopolitically axial. A power that dominates Eurasia would control 2 of the world's 3 most advanced and economically productive regions. A mere glance at the map also suggests that control over Eurasia would almost automatically entail Africa's subordination, rendering the Western Hemisphere and Oceania, that's Australia for all of you non-academics, geopolitically peripheral to the world's central continent. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for 60% of the world's GNP and 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. 2 basic steps are thus required. First, to identify the geostrategically dynamic Eurasian states that have the power to cause a potentially important shift in the international distribution of power, and to decipher the central external goals of their respective political elites and the likely consequences of their seeking to attain them. Second, to formulate specific U.S. policies to offset, co-opt, and or control the above. The man is talking about co-opting, controlling, managing, subverting nations and peoples and economies. To put it in a terminology that harkens back to the more brutal age of ancient empires, the 3 grand imperatives of imperial, listen to this, of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. That's on page 40. I'm telling you, you got to buy the book. Now we get really serious. On page 95, Uzbekistan, with its much more ethnically homogeneous population of approximately 25 million and its leaders emphasizing the country's historic glories, has become increasingly assertive in affirming the region's new post-colonial status. He saw the first step in this as diminishing the ability of Russia to reassert the dream of the Soviet Union. All the stands in Central Asia were once part of the Soviet Union. The borders were drawn arbitrarily by Lenin and Stalin. And he saw one of the most important steps was to prevent Russia from asserting any control in the region, which we did. You know how we did it? Over the last decade, thanks to Goldman Sachs, the Harvard Endowment, the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve, the World Bank, we looted $300 billion out of the Russian economy. $300 billion. I was there. The Russian population was, 64 million at the fall of the Soviet Union. The population of Russia is today 145 million. In another 10 years, it will be 130 million. The average life expectancy of a male in Russia has dropped to 48 years. Thanks to the economic devastation, the ruin we visited on their economy, it was a deliberate plan to weaken Russia so that it couldn't challenge our move into Eurasia a decade later. It helps if you see this on the map. Okay, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and China. Now, the proposed oil route is from here to here, 1,500 miles. China can't build it because it's 5,000 miles, and they don't have the technology to build it. We do, thanks to a company named Halliburton, which was chaired with the CEO was Dick Cheney, right? Okay, they're probably going to build the pipeline. Okay, so now that you see this relationship, what he's saying is you build a block starting with Islamic fundamentalism, which we've supported and created. to keep Russia from moving south to reassert control, but then you build up these countries so that they're so powerful, and with a weakened Russia, Russia can't make a move to control, and all the oil reserves are right in here. Okay? And we have effectively made China dependent upon our technology because they need the oil desperately. Now, Uzbekistan, nationally the most vital and the most populous of the Central Asian states, represents the major obstacle to any renewed Russian control over the region. Its dependence is critical to the survival of other Central Asian states and is the least vulnerable to Russian pressures. Where was the first place that President Bush announced we were sending troops after the attacks on September 11th? We were already there. We'd been training Uzbeki troops for more than 5 years. Referring to an area he calls the Eurasian Balkans and a 1997 map in which he circled the exact location. Now remember, this is a book written 4 years ago. And I'm going to show you a map where Zbigniew Brzezinski said the next world conflict was going to take place. Afghanistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. This is where he said 4 years ago the United States, in order to sustain its precarious, that's my words, economy, would have to control that to maintain its role as the global superpower and to become the world's only superpower. In effect, the ruling nation of the world. That's his map from 4 years ago. Referring to an area he calls the Eurasian Balkans and a 97 map in which he circled the exact location of the current conflict, describing it as the central region of pending conflict for world dominance, Brzezinski writes, moreover, the Central Asian republics are of importance from the standpoint of security and historical ambitions to at least 3 of their most immediate and more powerful neighbors, namely Russia, Turkey, and Iran, with China also signaling an increasing geopolitical interest in the region. And he really lets his hair down. More important as a potential economic prize, an enormous concentration of natural gas and oil reserves is located in the region in addition to important minerals including gold. Didn't know about the gold, did you? The world's energy consumption is bound to vastly increase over the next 2 or 3 decades. Estimates by the U.S. Department of Energy anticipate that world demand will rise by more than 50% between 1993 and 2015, with the most significant increase in consumption occurring in the Far East, China. The momentum of Asia's economic development is already generating massive pressures for the exploration and exploitation of new sources of energy in the Central Asian region, and the Caspian Sea basin are known to contain reserves of natural gas and oil that dwarf those of Kuwait, the Gulf of Mexico, and the North Sea. Once pipelines to the area have been developed, Turkmenistan's truly vast natural gas reserves augur a prosperous future. He's talking about the pipelines. Without sustained and directed American involvement, before long, the forces of global disorder. Global disorder? You mean democracy? Global disorder could come to dominate the world scene, and the possibility of such a fragmentation is inherent in the geopolitical tensions not only of today's Eurasia, but of the world more generally. The most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia, or even to diminish significantly its decisive arbitration role. In the long run, global politics are bound to become increasingly uncongenial to the concentration of hegemonic power in the hands of a single state. Hence, America is not only the first as well as the only truly global superpower, but is also likely to be the very last. And what does he say that's going to happen? He says that the United States will fold into a one-world government in which all nations will cease to exist, run by corporations. I'm paraphrasing it. Now, hold your breath. Very last pages in the book. Moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Read it again, she said. Maybe I should read this with a German accent. Wait a minute. Moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. Listen, I want you to know that the Third Reich did not lose the Second World War. It just changed venues. Now we're going to close with a summation. And you all are still with me. Nobody's fallen over in their chairs, right? Can I have a minute to take a hit off my Pepsi here? All right, now I'm going to run you through a timeline, which is what a detective would do for a prosecutor. I'm going to run you through a series of events with some information that's absolutely going to curl your socks. Or something. And let's start with some of this we've covered. 1998 and 2000, former President George Bush travels to Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Carlyle Group, the 11th largest defense contractor. While there, he meets privately with the Saudi royal family and the bin Laden family. Source, Wall Street Journal, September 27th. Also from The Wilderness, that's my newsletter, The Best Enemies Money Can Buy. And I hope some of you folks are going to subscribe tonight. Chris, wherever you are, raise your hand. January 2001, the Bush administration orders the FBI and intelligence agencies to back off investigations involving the bin Laden family, including two of Osama bin Laden's relatives, Abdullah and Omar bin Laden. There goes the black sheep theory, who were living, guess where? In Falls Church, Virginia, right next to CIA headquarters. This followed previous orders dating back to 1996, that's under Bill Clinton, frustrating efforts to investigate the bin Laden family. Source, BBC Newsnight correspondent Greg Palast. And on the TV broadcast, he actually held up an FBI national security report showing that the Bureau had been ordered to leave the bin Ladens alone. By the way, this is just for your edification. This is a copy of the BBC report showing that the Bush administration ordered the FBI to stop investigating the bin Laden family in January, right after taking office. February 13th, UPI terrorism correspondent Richard Sale, while covering a trial of bin Laden's al-Qaeda followers, reports that the National Security Agency has broken bin Laden's encrypted communications. They introduced the evidence into court. The NSA had broken his secure communications. Even if this indicates that bin Laden changed systems in February, it does not mesh with the fact that the government insists that the planning for the September 11th attacks took years. May 2001, Secretary of State Colin Powell gives $43 million in aid to the Taliban. Why? Good question. Purportedly to assist hungry farmers who are starving since the destruction of their opium crop. And in January on the orders of the Taliban. Source, the Los Angeles Times, May 22.
In the year 2000, the UN says that there were 3,276 tons of opium produced in Afghanistan. In 2001, they estimate that the total crop was 185 tons. That's a reduction of 94%. Now, in the Northern Alliance areas, there was an increase. There were two provinces that one place it grew by, I think, 185%, almost doubled, and another it increased tenfold. But even so, the Northern Alliance provinces, with their huge increase, they were 90% of this year's crop, but 90% of 185 tons is not enough to offset. There was a net loss of 3,100 tons of opium, and that would have been such a fantastic improvement in the world opium scene. But now that they are replanting fields all over Afghanistan with opium, that possible victory we could have seen over drugs is being wiped out as a result of the U.S. intervention.
May 2001, Deputy Secretary of State, one of my favorite guys in the whole world, Richard Armitage, a former Navy SEAL who used to go on kill missions in Laos and Cambodia, who has been dealing drugs for most of his adult life, who was involved in Iran-Contra and death squads, and who has been around this world as a covert operative, goes to India at the same time while the DCI, the CIA director George Tenet, travels to Pakistan. Armitage is the cover. It's a publicized tour. Tenet makes a quiet stop to Pakistan where he spends a long time with General Pervez Musharraf, our great ally in Pakistan. Pakistan's the largest supporter of terrorism in the world, by the way. Armitage has deep intelligence connections, but Tenet spends hours, and it would be reasonable to assume, wouldn't you agree, that the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, if he's meeting with the president of Pakistan, would also meet with the head of Pakistani intelligence? Wouldn't that make sense to you? Remember, the head of Pakistani intelligence has to be approved by the CIA by treaty. The guy's name is Lieutenant General Mahmood Ahmad. Source, the Indian Sapra News Agency, May 22nd. I have copies of all of these. My $1,000 is safe. June 2001, German intelligence, the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, warns the CIA and Israel that Middle Eastern terrorists are planning to hijack commercial aircraft to use as weapons to attack important symbols of American and Israeli culture. Source, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, that's a great newspaper in Germany, September 14th. July 2001. 3 American officials, Tom Simmons, former U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, Carl Inderfurth, former Assistant Secretary of State, Lee Coldren, former State Department expert on South Asia, meet with Pakistani and Russian intelligence officers in Berlin and tell them that the U.S. is planning military strikes against Afghanistan in October. A French book, La Vérité Interdite, discloses that Taliban representatives often sat in on the meetings. U.S. is going to the Taliban, now get this, and says, we're going to bomb you to smithereens in October. Could we call that provocation? Historically, there is a model. Franklin Roosevelt shut off the Japanese from oil supplies in the late 30s and early 40s to provoke them into attacking Pearl Harbor. Sources, The Guardian, September 22nd, the BBC, September 18th, and the Interpress News Service in Pakistan, November 16th. Summer 2001, according to a September 26th story in Britain's The Guardian, correspondent David Lee reported that U.S. Department of Defense official Jeffrey Starr visited Tajikistan in January. The Guardian's Felicity Lawrence established that U.S. Rangers were training special troops in Kyrgyzstan at that time. And there were unconfirmed reports that Tajik and Uzbek special troops were training in Alaska and Montana. Summer 2001, Pakistani ISI chief General Mahmoud, remember the guy I talked about, the guy that has to be approved by the CIA director by treaty? You're going to love this. Pakistani ISI chief General Mahmoud orders an aide to wire transfer $100,000 to Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker. Who was, according to the FBI, the lead terrorist in the suicide hijackings. Mahmoud recently resigned after the transfer was disclosed in India and confirmed by the FBI. Source, The Times of India, October 11th. Our allies wiring $100,000 to the lead hijacker before the attacks. Summer 2001, an Iranian man phones the U.S. law enforcement to warn of an imminent attack on the World Trade Center in the week of September the 9th. World Trade Center, September the 9th. German police confirmed the calls but state the U.S. Secret Service would not reveal any information. I got this from the German news agency Online, i.e. September 14th, 2001. August 2001. The FBI arrests an Islamic militant linked to bin Laden in Boston. French intelligence sources confirm the man is a key member of bin Laden's network, and the FBI learns that he has been taking flying lessons in Boston. At the time of his arrest in Boston, where two of the planes were hijacked, the man is in possession of technical information on Boeing aircraft and flight manuals. Reuters, September 13th. Summer 2001, Russian intelligence notifies the CIA that 25 terrorist pilots have been specifically training for suicide missions. This is reported in the Russian press, and I have one of my sources, I have several sources who are former CIA officers, translated the article for me. July 4th through 14th, Osama bin Laden receives treatments for kidney disease at the American hospital in Dubai and meets with the CIA official who returns to CIA headquarters on July 15th. This is the guy who blew up the coal and the embassies that Bill Clinton signed an order it's okay to execute. He gets treatment at an American hospital in Dubai and flies out on a private plane. Oliver North in the 80s, Oliver North is one of my least favorite people, but he sent Navy planes to track down terrorists on the Achille Lauro. The moment bin Laden entered international airspace, he would have been fair game. The source for this story is Le Figaro, French newspaper, October 31st. Now, I got to throw in a caveat here. Le Figaro is owned by the Carlyle Group. These guys can't control everybody, okay? And they can't control reporters. Le Figaro was emphatic that they had confirmed the details of the story. The CIA immediately came out with an adamant denial, but the CIA never lies. So did some people at the hospital. But you don't have to take this story as all or everything. But Le Figaro has not retracted the story. August 2001, Russian President Vladimir Putin orders Russian intelligence to warn the U.S. government in the strongest possible terms of imminent attacks on airports and government buildings. I watched it on MSNBC on September the 15th. August, September 2001, the Dow Jones Industrial Average drops nearly 900 points in the 3 weeks prior to the attack. A major stock market crash is imminent. September 3 through 10. MSNBC reports on September 16th that a caller to the Cayman Islands radio talk show gave several warnings of an imminent attack on the U.S. by bin Laden in the week prior to 9/11. These are just some of the advance warning bits that we have. Now, September 1 through 10. Some 25,000 British troops, the largest British naval armada since the Falkland Island War. It's not Essential Harvest, it's called Swift Sword. An operation in the planning for 4 years, are set to deploy to Oman in the week before the September 11th attacks. It takes years to plan this kind of a deployment. And yet the British government had been planning it for 4 years. After the attack on the 11th, there was a slight hiccup. They waited, but the deployment went ahead as scheduled, supposedly to support the U.S. But you have to understand, I don't know how many veterans we have in this room, but you have to understand that it takes months and months and months to deploy these kinds of personnel, yet they're already set to go to Oman. At the same time, 2 U.S. aircraft carrier battle groups happen to be rendezvousing off the Pakistani coast. This is not a normal deployment. The Pakistani coast is not the Persian Gulf, it's the Arabian Sea. Yet we have 2 aircraft carrier battle groups off the Pakistani coast, and at the same time, some 17,000 U.S. troops join more than 23,000 NATO troops for Operation Bright Star in Egypt. Fully deployed, combat ready, locked and loaded. All before September the 11th. Is this suspicious? I think so. September 6th through 7th. We have the 4,744 put options on United Airlines, CIA monitoring stock trading in real time. September 10th, 4,500 put options are purchased on American. September 6th through the 11th, no other airlines show any similar trading patterns to those experienced by UAL and American. The put option purchases on both airlines were 600% above normal. September 6th through 10th, put options on Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, AXA Reinsurance, and Munich Re. It has been documented, and I talked about this through the Promise software, that intelligence agencies routinely track the stock trading. And I'll tell you what I think, an opinion here, happened, is that someone at CIA told the head of A.B. Brown, and the head of A.B. Brown decided to make himself a little money on the side, and he got caught because the stock market was shut down because, well, we'll come to that in a second. General Mahmoud of the ISI, the guy that wired $100,000 to Mohammed Atta, the guy that had to be approved by the CIA, happened to be in Washington on September the 11th. He had arrived the week before. I think he was discussing war plans. That's from MSNBC. September the 11th, for 35 minutes from 8:15 a.m. until 9:05 a.m., with it widely known to the FAA and the military that 4 planes had been simultaneously hijacked and taken off course. No one notifies the President of the United States. It is not until 9:30 that any Air Force planes are scrambled to intercept, but by then it is too late. This means that the National Command Authority waited for 75 minutes before scrambling aircraft, even though it was known that 4 simultaneous hijackings had occurred, an event that has never happened in history. Sources: CNN, ABC, MSNBC, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times. And if you go to my website, you will see the beginning of a fabulous series of articles out of Canada by 2 writers, Ilarion Bykoff and Jared Israel. Their website is The Emperor's New Clothes. You can find all the links from my website, all these other sites. They've established clearly, using documents that have now been taken down off of U.S. Air Force websites, that it is a matter of routine policy on the FAA and the U.S. Air Force to scramble a jet the instant any airliner is hijacked without waiting for an order from the President.
What does that mean, scramble? I don't know, sorry.
You put them up in the air and make them go intercept the jet, not shoot it down, but you put a fighter aircraft in the airspace with the hijacked airliner. It's FAA routine procedure. It doesn't require an order from the President of the United States. Remember Payne Stewart? Remember his airplane? Remember it went off course? It was off course for no more than 10 minutes, and fighter jets had been scrambled to fly along beside it. Now, if we have 4 simultaneous hijackings, why were no planes scrambled to intercept those planes for 75 minutes? The Andrews Air Force Base website has taken down information saying that it maintained a ready response scramble force to protect the skies over Washington, D.C. A presidential order is not necessary to intercept an aircraft. It is necessary to shoot down an aircraft. And yet the government has committed a lot of lies. Dick Cheney has lied about U.S. Air Force response. I used to work outside Andrews Air Force Base. I saw F-16s, F-18s, F-15s taken off all the time.
So they took down that site?
They have changed the site. It has been archived and saved. If you go to my website, go to the articles, you can get links to the way it used to read. Okay? All right. September 13th. China is admitted to the World Trade Organization after 15 years of unsuccessful attempts. The vote was taken. It was just ratified about a week ago, but that was the vote. Nobody noticed. September 15th, the New York Times reports that Mayo Shattuck III, the head of A.B. Brown in the United States, resigned effective immediately without explanation. The insider trading, September 15th, was the first day that the stock market opened after the attacks. September 29th, the San Francisco Chronicle reports that 2.5 million in put options on American Airlines and UAL are unclaimed. This is the result of the suspension in trading. Nobody showed up to claim it. October 10th, the Pakistani newspaper Frontier Post reports that Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain has called on the Pakistani oil minister. The pipeline is now a go. Mid-October 2001, the Dow Jones is back up near 10,000 as a result of the massive looting, outpouring of cash. Gonna love this one. One of my dearest causes in the whole world, I have a couple of monthly columns in magazines, one of which is High Times, believe it or not. And that's a strange thing for an ex-narc who hasn't had a beer or a joint. I've had no mind-altering chemicals in 18 years. It'll be 19 in January. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I work a lot with men in recovery. I've written more than 30 articles on the subject of drug addiction and recovery for the U.S. Journal of Drug and Alcohol Dependence, and I can tell you that drug addiction is a medical, social, and spiritual problem. It is not a criminal problem. And one of the most frightening things that I saw in the wake, and we're going to wind this up here, and I'm going to hit you with everything that I got. One of the most frightening things that I saw in the wake of the attacks was a story that showed right here, this is from the New York Post, that the two companies, most of you know that some 30 to 40% of the prison inmates in this company are housed by private corporations who trade their stock on Wall Street based upon the number of human beings that they're housing in prison. That's what our economy has evolved into. We are a search and destroy economy. A snake eating its own tail is not nutritious, yet that's what we're doing. And I saw that the stocks of these two companies, Corrections Corporation of America and Wackenhut, went up 300% in the, 2 weeks after the attacks. And not only that, you read this story, and there was an urgent request outside of the budget for 40,000 new prison beds. That's before the next year's budget. Now, does anybody here think there are 40,000 Islamic terrorists in this country? Who are those beds for? I'll tell you when I get there, Okay? But the Bureau of Prisons budget request next year is supposed to ask for something, and this is not confirmed, but I've heard on the order of 400,000 new prison beds. Maybe more.
Do you have that on your site?
What I just showed you was in one of the issues of the newsletter on the site, yes. Now, in January of this year, when the Bush administration took office, these are the folks that brought us savings and loan with Lockheed Martin, DynCorp, looting $2 trillion out of the Department of Defense, $59 billion out of HUD. That's to sustain this bubble, to maintain the grip on power of this CFR trilateral group that has taken us into a war for Central Asian oil before the age of oil ends. And in January I said, they're going to go after Social Security. You mark my words. The savings and loan was just a warm-up. And here I find this story, or this letter, written to the Honorable Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who is the head of the President's Commission to strengthen, Newspeak, Orwell, strengthen Social Security. And the letter is from two members of Congress. It's from Henry Waxman, I don't have the second page, and one other member of Congress. And you know what they're saying? You've locked us out of your meetings. You're having closed-door, classified meetings on Social Security. We're the members of the Ways and Means Committee that are charged with Social Security oversight, and you have locked us out of the meetings. Does that scare you? It scares me. They've just been writing letters so far. Hey, listen, I'm going to come to this, but, there's a few bright lights on the hill. They aren't fully bright yet, but there are some people speaking out. And in the wake of the total assault on American civil liberties, Patrick Leahy, forgive me, had the temerity to write 6 letters to Attorney General John Ashcroft demanding that he testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on such matters as military tribunals and Ashcroft's unilateral decision to begin wiretapping attorney-client conversations in terrorist cases. And he said, I demand that you respond to me in writing. I think it was by the 13th. Well, he got a response in writing, but it was an anthrax letter. You notice they're only going to Democrats? All right, now let's look at this. H.R. 3162, the Patriot Act. Hey, let's hear it for the Patriot Act. Now it's group therapy. That's good. Okay. In the most recent issue of From the Wilderness, we covered some of the highlights or the lowlights of this bill. And I want you to listen to me very closely. This is your Constitution. We're coming now to pay the bill for the price that you, and remember how I defined you at the beginning of this presentation, as all of the American people who failed to reconcile accounts after the assassination of John Kennedy, of Bobby Kennedy, of Martin Luther King, of Iran-Contra, of Vietnam, of Panama, of savings and loan, of the genocide of 2 million people in Rwanda, of the rendering to radioactive waste of large portions of Iraq with depleted uranium that's contaminated with plutonium, the displacement of 1 million people in Colombia within the last year. The bills are coming due, and now it's your turn to pay. The Patriot Act that was passed just recently includes several provisions. First of all, the FBI can enter your home in a criminal investigation. I think it's criminal. They might have said terrorist. It doesn't make any difference how you define it. When you're not there, without a search warrant, they may seize whatever they want to seize and use it to convict you in a court of law for a crime when you didn't even know they came. Now, how many people know that the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution is supposed to protect us against unreasonable searches and seizures? The Patriot Act also permits the CIA to share its intelligence files with local law enforcement. Now, what does that mean? Everybody knows the agency's been wiretapping people illegally for a long time. So is the FBI, COINTELPRO. I mean, you know, but the deal is that that information, because it wasn't obtained under a warrant, could never be introduced into court as evidence. Now when the CIA turns all that information over to the Los Angeles Police Department or the Chicago Police Department, they can write that up as a probable cause statement, go out and find one other piece of evidence, and put it all into court. Gee, the Fourth Amendment is gone. The exclusionary rule is gone. The Act also provides that local police agencies can share their intelligence with the CIA, who may in turn share it with foreign intelligence agencies. We have the beginnings of a global secret police. Echelon is a program of wiretapping run by the United States, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And it was originally set up on the premise, gee, it's illegal for CIA to wiretap Americans, but there's nothing wrong with the Canadians doing it. And Americans will wiretap the British, and the Australians will wiretap, and then we all share it. That's Echelon. And now all that information now under the Patriot Act can now be used in terrorist criminal prosecutions. And it's going to get worse for you in just a minute here, if it isn't bad enough already. Okay. In addition, the Patriot Act allows cops to search for judges. You don't have to go to a judge in your jurisdiction. You can go to Joe Friendly Judge, thereby cutting out any judge that might refuse a warrant because it's not illegal. Or because it's illegal, excuse me. Now we have John Ashcroft saying he's going to wiretap attorney-client conversations in terrorist cases. Terrorist cases I'm only going to do it, I swear, you know, involving cases of terrorists with foreigners. Now, the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution says that we have an absolute right against self-incrimination, and protected communications are those between an attorney and his client, a husband and his wife, a priest or a spiritual leader and his confessor, gone. We have President George Walker Bush announcing by fiat, and it evoked a stirring series of editorials by conservative columnist William Safire, that he will now have military tribunals to try terrorists could be held here in the United States. And in those military tribunals, they don't have to reveal evidence if it's in the interest of national security. They don't have to disclose the voting. They don't have to publicize the trial. And the person convicted can be executed even if 1/3 of the officers disagree. The Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution provides the right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to confront one's accusers and to examine the evidence against him. Also, under the Patriot Act, it is legal for the FBI to come into any business on a terrorist investigation and seize all of the business records. And what's more, there's a clause in there that says that if it's your business, you can't tell anybody that the FBI was there, or they can lock you up. There goes the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, part of the First Amendment. Now, people who read this, who want to defend the Bush administration, will say, good grief, they wrote a sunset clause into this. It's supposed to go away after 4 years. Well, if you read the sunset clause, and it's in my last issue of From the Wilderness, there's a provision in there that says this clause applies except for in any case where where the investigation was begun before the sunset clause takes effect. The sunset clause doesn't exist. All they have to say is, we started this investigation before it's a date in 2005. And there is no sunset clause. There is no Santa Claus. Maybe. This is just the beginning. I didn't become a policeman to break laws. I became a policeman to protect people and to enforce laws.
In the article in Inside Magazine, it was mentioned that you didn't get a chance to read the bill completely before you had to vote on it. Is that true?
You know, that is interesting because a lot of people are fascinated with that possibility, and it is true. And they think, well, is this the first time that's happened? And I say, no. Anything that's important, that's the usually way they do it. Unfortunately, what they do is they pull these shenanigans and say, you don't have much time. But we looked real hard for that bill. And even while I was going to the floor, the staff still could not get it off the internet. So that in itself should have been a reason for everybody to vote against it. So there was not a full disclosure there. We had an idea that they were taking a reasonably bad bill and substituting a very bad bill, which was the Senate version. The House had actually cleaned up the Senate version to some degree, but they switched it at the last minute. We did not have it in front of us, so that even made it that much easier to vote against.
And I am a very poor example. 23 years. I've been shot at twice. I've been made homeless. I've been forced into bankruptcy. I was told that if I ever had children, they'd be killed. I was denied employment. I was arrested on phony charges. I've had all of that in 23 years, and yet my sacrifice pales by comparison to some brave men I know. And I'll mention two out of dozens that I know. One is Celerino Castillo, a DEA agent who lives in McAllen, Texas, in poverty, who watched the CIA loading planes full of cocaine at Ilopango Airfield in El Salvador, who confronted Vice President George Bush then, and who was told to leave it alone. It's a White House operation. The DEA forced him out and almost killed him like Serpico. And the other is a Marine colonel by the name of Jim Sabo, who caught those CIA C-130s flying cocaine onto his base at El Toro Marine Air Station and was murdered because of it. People like us, and I'm just one of many, have been trying to tell people like you that unless you face this now and pay the price, this is what the end result is going to be, and it's only going to get worse. Catherine Austin Fitts has a great saying, if we can face it, God can fix it. But it can't happen until we face it. Now let me show you what's on the drawing boards. This is being debated right now. Model State Emergency Health Powers Act as of October 23rd. This goes in conjunction with the 300 million doses of smallpox vaccine that are being ordered. This is an act that will give state and local governments the right to seal off neighborhoods, herd people into stadiums, close down all transportation, water, and communications, seal off everything, suspend the Constitution, seize property, and suspend the writ of habeas corpus. All justified under a supposed threat of massive biological warfare. This is being debated right now. The criminality of this regime is out of the closet. I noticed it was out of the closet in May when Citibank bought Banamex. They don't care anymore. They're arrogant. But I got news for you. These guys, and especially George W. Bush, play in a rigged game. They've always played in a rigged game. And those who play in a rigged game get stupid. Because they don't have to perform. Their arrogance gets them. Now, if you have any lingering doubts, and you can go to my website and read all of these documents of Operation Northwoods. These are declassified top secret documents from 1962 showing that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had planned to shoot down 2 American airliners and blame it on Fidel Castro for the purpose of getting a war with Cuba. You don't have to believe me. Go read the declassified documents yourself. They don't care about us. Okay? They're all on the website. The victorious warlord set to open opium floodgates. The Northern Alliance is planting opium poppies hand over fist, and the CIA will control that drug trade and control the money to keep the bubble on Wall Street afloat. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. I may have scared you, and I love it when people come up to me and say, Mike, what am I supposed to do? And I know that in your head you're saying, you don't want me to tell you what you're supposed to do because what you want me to tell you is something that'll let you go home, drink a beer, watch your television set, and manage your 401k plan. Okay? Yeah, you can write, and I got to tell you, From the Wilderness, my newsletter has doubled in size since September the 11th. And you know what I'm doing with the money? I'm hiring reporters and I'm writing more stories. One thing you can do... One thing you can do is vote with your money. Stop giving money to people who lie to you. Okay? Now, I'll give you a little word of inspiration. This is a comment on the Patriot Act. It says our forefathers would think it's time for a revolution. This is why they revolted in the first place. They revolted against much milder oppression. And who said it? A Republican Congressman, Ron Paul of Texas.
To vote against the Patriot Act was a very easy vote for me. To me, it was a clear violation of the civil liberties of all Americans. It was called Patriot Act because they didn't want anybody to vote against it, claiming that if you didn't vote for it, you weren't a patriotic American citizen. I think it was probably the opposite way. I think those who voted for it voted for a bill that undermined the Fourth Amendment, the whole principles of individual freedom and liberty in this country. So it was very easy for me to oppose a bill that would just open up Pandora's box with search warrants and the whole ability to wiretap and listen to all our communications, whether they were on the internet, and check on websites, the whole works. It was very easy for me to vote against that bill.
And there are other actions taken by the administration, including military tribunals and Attorney General Ashcroft's announcement that he was going to wiretap attorney-client conversations. How do those make you react?
I guess there are two there. I don't like what he's doing, but the other part is how did we get to this point in our history where our administration, our presidents, and our attorney generals do this by fiat? Just come up and declare, well, there's going to be new military tribunals set up, or we're going to wiretap communications between the accused and their lawyers, and they didn't even confer with the Congress. So I would say that's very bad. Of course, there's the slippery slope there. They say, well, we're only going to do this with the terrorists. Well, how do we know who the terrorists are if they haven't had a trial? So the whole thing is just outlandish for a country that pretends to protect the rights of the accused, and we challenge other countries like Peru in recent years for setting up these type of tribunals. So I think that moving in this direction is a serious challenge to the whole principles of the 10 Amendments and the Constitution.
For all the FBI agents in the audience, a revolution can be anything, but I will tell you this, that a revolution, according to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Monroe, and all of the founding fathers, is my divine right. One of the most offensive statements I have heard since September the 11th was Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge, when he was sworn in. And he said, civil liberties are one of the most precious gifts that we give our citizens. I got news for you, Governor Ridge. These are inalienable rights. You don't give nothing to me, we give them to you. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus, and it led to one of the most powerful and most important trials that ever reached the Supreme Court of the United States. The case was Ex parte Milligan. And this is what they had to say. They said, the Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people equally in war and in peace, and covers with the shield of its protection all classes of men at all times and under all circumstances. No doctrine involving more pernicious consequences was ever invented by the wit of man than that any of its provisions can be suspended during any of the great exigencies of government. That was when we had a Supreme Court. Now, I want you to bear in mind, you may think that the system of government is still mildly working here. That, well, we had a law and you know what, so Congress is working, but you know, Congress is totally subdued. They're rolled over, they're not fighting, so you think it's the court. But bear in mind that the current Supreme Court is the one that illegally gave George W. Bush the election victory. And when I say illegally, I mean it was a butchery in the major media, because the Florida law said the clear intent of the voter. And what happened was the Supreme Court stopped the counting when there were thousands of ballots left uncounted that would have shown the clear intent of the voter, and said, we're going to make a one-case exception here, and we're going to say that we stopped the count, and we're going to just recount the votes that we have and ignore the votes where we could still determine the clear intent of the voter. That was an illegal decision. So where do you go after that?
The first most important thing that the American people should remember is how George Bush came to the White House. 1, through fraud, and 2, through buying the election. The most money ever spent in the history of the United States for this office. That's a crime, and that's a shame.
All right, we are living, get this, in an empire. Bill Sapphire said this about George W. Bush. He said, on what legal meat does this our Caesar feed? Bill Sapphire said that. Okay? And it is an empire. Now, I want to go all the way back, and I want to take you back before I shut up here and leave you with one of my favorite quotes of all time. The foundation of all mental illness is the avoidance of legitimate suffering. And the country is mentally ill. It'll wake up sooner or later. I don't know when. I'm not God. I don't know where this is going. I know that my job is to teach. My job is to give you information. And my job is to clarify for you what's at stake here.
Let's look at the fact that, and this is the most important point, it appears to me that the American people might have a criminal syndicate running their government.
This will be especially important if we were to consider changing the structure of the intelligence community, and that is the challenge of...
What's at stake here is your liberty. This is a criminal administration. It will not stop. It cannot turn back. President Bush broke the Presidential Records Act of 1978 by refusing to release the Ronald Reagan papers. Arbitrarily broke the law. John Ashcroft broke the law by ordering wiretaps of attorney-client conversations in terrorist cases. The Supreme Court doesn't exist. They're grabbing for the power right now, and you better rest assured, as sure as I'm standing here tonight, that the war that's supposed to be taking place against terrorism is also a war against you. Thank you very much.